Okay, so this is coming up all right?
Yep.
Yep, okay, great. So this presentation is called From Cultural to Physical Genocide, China's oppression of the Uyghurs in East Turkestan. So I will start off with this slide, which shows you just where East Turkestan is, which is the home of the Uyghur people. So it's in the northwest of China. It's quite a lot of the landmass that China controls. I'll just go through this stuff briefly before we get onto more substantive stuff, but Uyghur scholars estimate that there are around 20 million people who live there. Uyghur people, that is, that live there, although that is disputed, and Chinese officials say that there are many less Uyghur people that live there. So East Turkestan is in Central Asia. So even though it's controlled by China and is internationally recognized as part of China, it's right there beside Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. So East Turkestan is the historical homeland of the Uyghurs. So they're a Turkic-speaking people. So they speak the language called Uyghur, and that's a Turkic language like many other languages in Central Asia. It's been quite a significant place for a long time. A lot of trade has gone through there. And understandably, Uyghurs are proud of their history and who they are. Islam was first introduced to the Turkic world in Kashgar, which is in East Turkestan in the 10th century. So the Qing dynasty of China invaded in 1876, and they renamed East Turkestan Xinjiang in 1884. That means new territory in Chinese. Since then, there has been a struggle for their self-determination, and they have staged uprisings against Chinese rule. So that happened in 1933 and also 1944, going so far as setting up an independent East Turkestan Republic. In 1949, after that was at the end of the Chinese Civil War, China, newly controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, reoccupied East Turkestan, and China has controlled it ever since. And in 1955, they renamed it what it is known as now within China, which is the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. It's really just autonomous in name, but not autonomous in reality. It is very much under the control of Beijing. So this has been put together by Uyghur, actually the guy on the first slide called Dr. Ekin Siddiq, I think is his name, and then we've made some edits to it to make it relevant to us. But this is, I guess, a lot of the stuff that he feels is relevant to show what Uyghur people are about. I'm afraid I can't comment too much on that, but I'll go to the next slide, which is showing you some images of what East Turkestan looks like. And this brief little point is just about how rich East Turkestan is in natural resources, which makes it economically important to Beijing. So they have lots of oil, they have lots of gas, they have lots of coal, they make lots of cotton, and it looks like they make they grow lots of tomatoes as well. So this is the outline of what we're going to go through in this presentation. What is happening, and that's going to be the majority of this presentation. Then why is it happening? What is the international response, and how can we help? And then we'll go off and we'll have a bit of a conversation with Tauno and Golriz. So this here is a summary of what is happening. So from here on, I'll refer to the Chinese Communist Party as the CCP. meaning the Chinese state, which is in control of East Turkestan or Xinjiang. So they're working to eradicate the Uyghurs as a cultural group. There has been a program of mass detention and indoctrination underway since early 2017. That's not to say there wasn't a lot of bad stuff happening before then, but everything ramped up then. Now we estimate between 1 and 3 million Uyghurs held in concentration camps, also prisons, and state-run orphanages and boarding schools for younger people. They are subject to various forms of torture. I don't know if to be clear, I don't know if I'd say that about the young people, but I'll come back to this later. But the reason why there are young people who are held in facilities is because their parents are held in facilities, so the children get taken off. And the concentration camps and in the prisons, they're subject to various forms of torture, and many have died in custody or been executed in custody. What the CCP claims it's doing is it's re-educating Muslim extremists. So there's a lot of Islamophobic propaganda going on behind this. As I've just explained to you, the children of detained parents are sent to orphanages. I want to be clear at this point, the Uyghurs aren't the only Turkic Muslim ethnic group in East Turkestan for whom East Turkestan is home, even though the Uyghurs are the predominant group. So you have Kazakhs, you have Uzbeks as well. These people are viewed and treated similarly by the CCP, and I'll go a little bit further on into why that is, what's really going on and why this is happening. So in terms of other stuff that's going on, Uyghurs, so of course, and other Turkic Muslims are subject to a highly sophisticated and extremely intrusive system of surveillance. So data on all Uyghurs is harvested and it's fed into algorithms that determine who should be detained and indoctrinated. So the CCP is trying to assess who is less loyal to them, who do they want to indoctrinate. When the program of mass detention as we know it now began in early 2017, all contact between East Turkestan and abroad was cut off. Uyghurs are generally not permitted to leave East Turkestan, so there's this real tightening of control over people. Most prominent or high-profile Uyghurs have been placed in concentration camps or sentenced to long prison terms. So I'll go more into that later. A big aspect of what is happening, and an increasingly big aspect of what's happening, is that detained Uyghurs are usually sent to factories and used as forced labour. There are Western companies that are profiting from this. In East Turkestan, there is a very heavy presence of armed security forces everywhere. People's movement is restricted. You have to go through checkpoints all the time, often at every intersection in the different cities. So as you can imagine, the human rights abuses happening are serious. Security forces commit torture, extrajudicial killing, and they do so with impunity, and tens of thousands of Uyghurs are missing. This is all part of a fierce campaign to eradicate Uyghur culture and Islam from East Turkestan. So attendance at mosques and other expressions of Muslim faith often lead to people being detained in the concentration camps. The use of the Uyghur language is generally banned. The CCP wants people speaking Mandarin Chinese, and all Uyghur language books that the state has managed to get their hands on have been collected and destroyed. And actually that final point, I'm not sure if, actually I think that's that well fact-checked. I don't think we know how many Uyghurs have been relocated to other regions of China, but it seems like quite a few, at least 500,000. I'll come back to that later. So this is what the different tools are, I guess you could say, for eradicating the Uyghurs. Forced assimilation is an important part of this. The physical and psychological harm that Uyghurs are subject to. What's being done in terms of preventing reproduction, separating families, and then also the level of killing that's going on. So here, just to outline for you the different aspects of what the CCP is doing. So mass detention and forced labour is the first thing. The second one, efforts to stamp out Uyghur culture. And then lastly, the other human rights abuses, the mass surveillance and the tyranny that Uyghurs are subject to who are not being detained. So you can see what some of the concentration camps look like. These are described by the CCP as vocational training centres, but that is not what they are, and we will look at that as we go through these slides. So these are, you can see them from Google Maps. Yeah, these are big walled complexes that have got barbed wire around them. And they're defended. So the organisation Batawanta has conducted undercover investigations of these camps across East Turkestan, and they managed to get inside a few of them. So from one of these that they got into, they found that 15 people can be detained in each cell. They clearly look like prisons. Yeah, double iron doors. Because these are places of indoctrination that the CCP says are places of education. You have teachers and students, but it's all very, it's not at all like an ordinary learning environment. There is omnipresent surveillance everywhere, and so people are constantly being surveilled. Many of these concentration camps are built alongside factory complexes so that the detainees can also be used for forced labour. And these are some images that Dr. Siddiq put together. So kind of, this is to explain what the general idea is behind the concentration camps. So what the Chinese Communist Party is saying is that they are striking at terrorism and notions of separatism in East Turkestan. In their view, the root of terrorism and separatism in East Turkestan lies in what they call the problematic ideas of Uyghurs and other Turkic groups. I haven't put it into the slides, but I guess it's relevant to say that during this century, there has been an escalation of kind of the rhetoric against Turkic peoples in East Turkestan, and yeah, and the violence. And in recent years, it's really escalated. By that, I mostly mean, sorry, to be clear, there were in 2009, in response to some of the stuff going on then, there was a terrorist attack, and then that's kind of been the how would you say, what's led to a very, very serious response in the years to come, kind of in the way that 9/11 led to a lot of awful things happening in places like the States and what we've had in the last 20 years. It's a bit of a similar story to that. So in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party, Uyghur Turkic Muslim identity, not mainstream Han China's identity, is the problem. They see this as the threat. It has to be corrected or eradicated. The CCP aims to force the detainees to abandon their faith, to renounce their faith in God and their cultural identity, and to replace these with Han Chinese identity and loyalty to the state. So they describe the detainees as students. The goal is ideological transformation, as they put it. So there's a whole lot of Orwellian doublespeak going on here. Graduation or release is envisaged for those who transform sufficiently to the eyes of the CCP. So to talk about what kind of happens in these concentration camps, detainees are subject to constant propaganda. Oh, I missed a point, sorry. They're forced to learn and speak Mandarin Chinese. They're punished if they speak their own language. Yeah, they're subject to constant propaganda. They're forced to sing the praises of the CCP, to parrot the propaganda back to their teachers. They're forced to admit to things, confessions for things they've done wrong, and punishment is constant and severe. Yeah, they're forced to memorize the rules applicable to them outside the camps, which are numerous, as we'll discuss later. So conditions in the camps vary, and they can be really, really, really bad. So this woman called Mehrigal Tursun, she testified before the US Senate on her experience of being incarcerated in one of the camps in the first 3 months of 2018. So like her, so she was educated. She was studying in Egypt with her family, with her husband there and her children there. She came back to China to bring her kids back so they could stay with her mum, I think it was. And then when she came back, she was arrested and went in and out of prison, the concentration camps a couple of times. It seems like she was viewed with suspicion because she had been overseas, and the CCP views people, Uyghurs who go overseas, with a lot of suspicion. So she was in a cell, a 40 square meter cell. When she arrived, there were 40 people. When she left, there were 68 people who are all kind of well-educated professionals like her. At night, 10 to 15 women would stand up while the rest would sleep on their sides, and they'd rotate every 2 hours so everyone could get some sleep. During the nights, they would hear the detained men being beaten and tortured. She herself was tortured by electrocution. And like her cellmate, she faced malnutrition, forced medication, what she reports as medication that was causing loss of menstruation. She witnessed 9 deaths in her cell over the 3 months she was there. Yeah, she reported specifically about 2 of them to the Senate. What she talked about was one dying from the medication, and the other, I believe it's referred to others, were generally dying from the other just inhumane conditions that people can't survive in, especially if you're old, especially if you have medical problems, if you have medical problems that are caused by the situation. So yeah, so she saw those deaths. Her testimony indicates that there may be significant numbers of Uyghurs who are dying in detention. It's really hard to know how many that is. But something that Uyghurs are drawing our attention to is that the state is building a lot of crematoria across East Turkestan, and sometimes in proximity to the concentration camps. So that's all pretty grim. Yeah. Here are some images of people who have died in the camps. There are, of course, lots of other stories about things that have been happening in the concentration camps. Many of them are contained in the Human Rights Watch report from September 2018. And they report things like what Mehrigal reported: extreme overcrowding, beatings, different forms of torture, rape, lack of medical care, and deaths in custody. So yeah, there's another Safragal Soetsbay, she's in fact a Kazakh. She was detained in one of the camps around the same time as Mehrigal. She described constant punishment, sexual abuse, and medical experimentation. Yeah, and she's described some of the torture that she faced, or that others faced. Sorry, I can't see it because of the images of our faces. So yeah, as I was saying, there is torture in the camps. I don't really want to spend too long on those different photos. So what do we know about the scale of the internment? So yeah, I'll be clear that there are a lot of Uyghurs and people of other Turkic minorities in prisons as well as in concentration camps. So concentration camps are what they call the vocational re-education centres, which are meant for indoctrination. I mean, I guess in prisons they're indoctrinating as well, but it's when they can say that you've done something wrong and they convict you and they continue to prison for it. So these can be very minor things. It could be wearing a beard, a Muslim looking beard in public. It could be because you're praying in public. That could be the kind of thing that you could end up sentenced for and in prison. So prisons and concentration camps. A lot of what we know about the scale of the overall detention is from satellite imagery. Yeah, so over time, we can see the construction and the expansion of the detention facilities. So a researcher in December 2018 estimated that there was capacity for 1.36 million people in East Turkestan, but that was probably a conservative figure just based on what he clearly could identify as detention facilities. This kind of illustrates the point about what we can see about the camps being constructed. So that was during 2017 when the mass internment really began. Increasingly, we're hearing about Uyghurs being transported to detention facilities in other provinces of China. And this really seemed to happen in late 2018, kind of when the world was finding about what was happening. And it seems that they did this in order to try to obscure the scale of the internment from the outside world. It also makes it harder for international observers to see what's going on if the detainees are spread around China. So yeah, thanks to sources within the CCP, it was estimated then, end of 2018, that 500,000 Uyghurs were being transferred to other provinces. One particular place I can draw your attention to is this enormous detention facility in the desert in Gansu province. So in June 2017, Chinese Communist Party officials posted on social media announcements of the construction of a 100,000 person prison. So this is, yeah, that's absolutely massive. It is understood that many Uyghur detainees have been relocated to that province. We don't know whether they're taking them there, but Lishan Farm has received attention as somewhere that they could be transferred to. And looking at what it looks like on Google Maps now, there is more there than there was in this photo, which is a couple of years old. And yeah, on Google Maps now, there's more stuff being added to that, although I don't know how old that is. So yeah, it's been expanding. Another way to look at the scale of the internment is to look at the impact on the communities left behind. So I'll read this out from the Human Rights Watch report. It is not uncommon to find Uyghurs, particularly from Hotan and Kashgar in the south of the province, perceived by the authorities as anti-government hotspots, reporting that half or more of their immediate family members are in a mix of political education camps, pre-trial detention, and prison. For example, an interviewee said her husband, his 4 brothers, and their 12 nephews, that is all the men in the family, have been detained in political education camps since 2017. Also, if you actually go to Hotan and Kashgar, as someone from Vice did in the middle of last year, they came across cities that were relatively empty, a lot of abandoned streets and padlocked houses, showing significant numbers of people who aren't there. So here's a little bit of an illustration of that. Yeah, economic activity has been, yeah, I don't know if this is just, if there's some other reason that the market isn't there, yeah, but certainly big changes have been happening for the people of East Turkestan. So another way to look at the scale of the detention is by looking at the things that people are being detained for, because people are being detained for for the most ridiculous things, which make the CCP assess them as threats, threats to the state. Yeah, things as simple as praying or fasting. Fasting if other people know that you're fasting, even if you do it in private from Ramadan. I'll go later into the intrusions into people's privacy. Yeah, I'll let you guys just look at that. Yeah, I'll come back to some of the stuff later. So Uyghurs all across the world are testifying to their missing family members. Like I said earlier, contact has been cut off between East Turkestan and the rest of the world. So Uyghurs can't talk to their family members, and the CCP tends to view Uyghurs who are abroad as a particular threat. I guess they're a threat of spreading the word and trying to make action happen. So authorities are particularly keen to make sure that communication doesn't happen between Uyghurs abroad and Uyghurs in East Turkestan, and many don't know whether their families are in custody, whether their family members are alive. The CCP tries to stop Uyghurs in East Turkestan from talking to their family members overseas. So moving on to children. So as I said to you earlier, because there are a lot of adults who are being held in detention facilities, often you have both parents who aren't there, so the children get taken into state custody as well. So in 2018, there were approximately 500,000 children enrolled in government-owned boarding schools. So that's children who are, I suppose, over the age of 5. I haven't looked exactly at how old you need to be in a boarding school. But yeah, it's widely understood that the children of detained parents are raised in state-run orphanages and boarding schools. So that's the situation for around at least 500,000 school-age Uyghur children. So obviously what's happening in there is has similar themes to what's happening to the parents in terms of indoctrination. So they're trying to erase the Muslim values, they're trying to erase the beliefs, they're trying to erase their culture, the culture of these children, and to make them into something different. They're trying to, in their words, cultivate their patriotism and love for the Chinese Communist Party. So again, these are more images that Dr. Siddiq has put together of what Uyghur kids used to be like. And then we've got images of Uyghur kids in these facilities. Yeah, and obviously Uyghur kids being without their parents. Another aspect of this with people in detention is that there's likely organ harvesting going on, as we know happens with Falun Dafa. So it's estimated that each year up to 90,000 of China's prisoners have organs removed. And then there's this that was on Japanese television, where organs are being transported through the airport in Kashgar. Moving on to forced labour. So there's mounting evidence that Uyghurs who are deemed to have graduated from their indoctrination programs in the concentration camps are being sent to work as forced labour in factories across the province. There was a major leak of Chinese Communist Party documents late last year about the camps in general and the system of surveillance, confirming that it is intended that they be placed in work facilities where they will remain closely surveilled and indoctrinated. Bitter Winter, which has been monitoring the development of the camps in East Turkestan, they have documented the construction of many factories adjacent to or inside the concentration camps, and reported that the students are sent there for forced work. So it may actually be that forced labour is an integral part of being in the concentration camps for many detainees. Yeah, so here's some of the reasoning behind that. It's like killing two birds with one stone. This is what an interviewed worker said at one of the sites. By sending people to the concentration camps, the Communist Party can detain and transform all those who are deemed disobedient. On the other hand, it uses them as free labour in the factories to make considerable profits. It is a good deal for the Communist Party. So there was some research that came out recently by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, estimating that between 2017 and 2019, at least 80,000 Uyghurs were actually transferred out of East Turkestan into other provinces of China and assigned to factories to work. Now, I know that's a lot of text. The point of that is to show that there are lots of companies, including lots of Western companies, who are benefiting from the forced labour. So there is a high degree of complicity by Western businesses in all this. Moving on now to efforts in general to stamp out Uyghur culture. The previous bit is the largest section of the slideshow, just to let you know. So Islam is effectively banned in Xinjiang province. People can practice in private, but they can still be punished for it. For many, attendance at the mosque will lead to detention. Praying in public is prohibited, as I've said already. The Quran and praying mats have been burned, those that the state has managed to get its hands on. All public expressions of Muslim faith are banned. That goes even to maintaining beards that look, in the eyes of the CCP, as Muslim beards. Many community mosques have been demolished and have been turned into other things like entertainment facilities. Islamic marriage ceremonies are prohibited. Uyghur parents are banned from giving their children a certain number of names that are deemed as religious names. So what the Chinese Communist Party says is that all of these things are signs of extremism and will lead to detention. So this is really extreme Islamophobia. Inside the concentration camps, detainees must renounce their faith, otherwise they will continue to be detained. There is also some really awful stuff going on where Han Chinese men are often installed in Uyghur homes whose male family members have been detained, and there is also forced marriage going on. This is kind of part of the assimilation strategy, obviously with really, which is obviously horrific. Another aspect of the efforts to stamp out Uyghur culture, many prominent Uyghurs have been placed in detention, a number have been sentenced to death. So here are more images that have been put together. Festival dances before 2017, and then 2019. And here we've got forced marriages. And Uyghur families forced to live with Han Chinese. Also these photos of women who, I guess, whose dresses are determined to not be what, I guess that kind of speaks for itself, really. So don't have to read this, of course, but there's a long list here of prominent Uyghurs who've been detained or sentenced. I'll move on to the next slide where there's a bit more, the next slide again where there's more about this. You've got people like the head of the Xinjiang Department of Education was given a death sentence, president of Xinjiang University, also death sentence. Same for the president of the medical university, and then life imprisonment for Yalkun Rosie on the right. So this is a brutal silencing of people who are important figures in Uyghur culture. So here you have some images of the Quran being burnt, of praying mats being destroyed, and the demolishing of mosques. There was a deadline in 2017 for people to turn in their Qurans and praying mats. And people floated their Qurans in the river at midnight before the deadline is. As according to Islam, I'm told this was a better way to dispose of them than allowing the CCP to do what they want to do. So you have a number of awful things like Uyghurs being forced to drink alcohol. You also have Uyghurs being forced to raise pigs and eat pork. In particular in the concentration camps, they are forced to eat pork. Okay, so this next section is talking about the mass surveillance and the tyranny that the people are generally under, if that hasn't been clear already. So Uyghurs sometimes describe life in East Turkestan, this is outside the camps, as living in an open-air prison. So the surveillance is extreme. So there are CCTV cameras everywhere, in some places in front of every home. Biometric data from everyone is forcibly collected. State spyware is mandatorily installed onto devices, allowing electronic activities to be monitored. And if you try to install a messaging app that it's not going to be able to get through to, then that's the kind of thing that will get you detained. So government officials or employees, they perform compulsory home visits and stay overnight sometimes. And people are encouraged to spy on one another and report their activities to the authorities. So they're trying to create an atmosphere of terror. So the kinds of restrictions that people are subject to varies depending on how the CCP assesses how loyal or disloyal you are to them. So if you're deemed as less loyal, then they're going to put more restrictions on you. They make people attend Mandarin Chinese classes, things like weekly flag raising ceremonies and propaganda sessions. Movement is heavily restricted, and movement is more heavily restricted for those the state doesn't like. So many Uyghurs are in fact subject to house arrest. As I said before, militarized checkpoints are everywhere, and people get punished for perceived infractions on the spot. As I've said before, all of these various forms of data are fed together. It goes into a single database, and then the algorithms process the data to determine who should be arrested and placed in the concentration camps. So kind of perversely, this actually happens by machine. And it's hard for people to know whether they are going to be detained or not. And I guess that's part of the terror and the fear that's created. So there's information on that in the link in that system that they have. So there is a very important impact of all this on Uyghurs who are overseas. So this is a Facebook post from someone about their relative in Australia who said that the Chinese police rang her relative, told her that a number of her family members have been arrested and taken to the internment camps. And the Chinese police demanded that if she stops her activism now, then they'll release everyone immediately. So what the CCP is doing with regard to Uyghurs who are trying to speak up overseas is they're trying to blackmail them by exerting punishment on their family members who are in East Turkestan and trying to make them stop what they're doing, trying to make Uyghurs overseas be silent, so that their relatives back home will be safe or will not be subject to further punishment. So why is this happening? Probably a lot of that is quite clear by this point, but I will briefly go through some more analysis that's been put together. So the original writer of these slides, Dr. Siddiq, he put together this analysis for us. So there is a pattern of Han culture assimilating other cultures. That can be said, of course, of many cultures that assimilate other cultures, particularly when you have awful governments involved, as we all have. You have the nature of the leadership in China, of the ruling class. The brutal nature of how things are done. Again, not that that's unlike other places in the world, but anyway. The need for land and resources, but not the need for people. And his analysis, there is an opportunity right now. For this, China has a lot of economic power, and other countries in the world aren't so keen to be on the wrong side of China. You've got the Belt and Road Initiative of projects, which I'll talk about in the next couple of slides. And then he also posits that there is a need for China the CCP to engage in an imperialist kind of conflict, and that this is a part of that. So, sorry, the top of that heading is missing, but I think that's 2 million Uyghurs have actually been killed since the 1930s. So, yeah, this, terrible stuff has actually been happening for quite a long time, even though we're going through this really terrible phase right now. So 1 million Uyghurs were killed between 1933 and 1942. Many were killed after the 1949 invasion, around 1 million. And again, over 1 million fled East Turkestan in 1969. And then you have a number of mass killings over a period of time as well. So 1990, 1997, 2009, 2014, and even one recently in 2018, which I'm afraid I don't have information on for you. So the Belt and Road Initiative is relevant to what the CCP is doing. So it's a global program of infrastructure investments designed to facilitate trade with China, with I think over 70 countries in the world. So East Turkestan is a really important region because it connects China to Pakistan and Central Asia. So the CCP really wants to cement its control over East Turkestan. They don't want any notions of self-determination, so that they can use the region for these initiatives that are in the end about making profit for Chinese capitalism. So this is actually the section going into now, what is the international response? And the first bit that I'm covering here is why there isn't a response from Muslim countries. So there has mostly been silence, and experts and activists say that it's because countries fear economic retribution from China. Also because a lot of these countries, a lot of Arab states have poor human rights records themselves. Turkey has tried to speak up to some extent. I'm sorry, I don't know the details of that relationship. So in this analysis here, Muslim nations don't want to damage their relations with China, consider China a potential ally against the West and the US, and therefore they are trying to stay silent. As much as this point can be raised, I'd also like to say that actually, I think that countries all across the world, including New Zealand's, are being relatively silent about this because of the economic relationship with China. You can compare the situation with what happened in Myanmar with the genocide of the Rohingyas, where Myanmar is a much less powerful country, and it takes a lot less political capital to denounce what's going on over there compared to in East Turkestan. So here are some specific examples of, you can see the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. which has got the Chinese flag on it. In the corner, you've got Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia shaking hands with Xi Jinping. Yeah. So moving on to what's happening more internationally in the UN. So in October 2019, a group of UN member states two groups of UN member states published opposing statements on the human rights situation. So firstly, a number of countries, including New Zealand, had a very mild statement about what the Chinese Communist Party need to do to make things better. And then a number of other countries disagreed with that. So I know this is really pathetic and appalling, but it's worth a slide nonetheless. So what the New Zealand and other governments said is the Chinese government should urgently implement the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination's 8 recommendations related to Xinjiang, including by refraining from the arbitrary detention of Uyghurs and members of other Muslim communities. Furthermore, we call on the Chinese government to allow the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and UN Special Procedures immediate, unfettered, meaningful access to Xinjiang. I don't know if you can even call that a slap on the wrist. Belarus made an opposing statement with the support of a few other signatories, including Russia, Egypt, and Serbia, speaking positively of the results of counterterrorism and de-radicalization measures in Xinjiang, noting that these measures have effectively safeguarded the basic human rights of all ethnic groups. So that's kind of what's happening on the international. There is one more thing, which is that there has been some motivation by US lawmakers to respond to what's happening. And there is legislation that is in the US Congress now which would condemn the program of mass detention, impose sanctions on CCP officials, and ban the sale of US-made goods to CCP agents in Xinjiang province. So that's been approved by the House of Representatives, but not the Senate. This is the final slide from me. And this is conveying some of what Uyghurs want out of this situation. So I understand what Uyghurs want is condemnation of the CCP's crimes against humanity and their attempts to eradicate the Uyghurs, stop trading with China, protect the lives of the Uyghur people currently held in detention, close the detention facilities, the concentration camps, release the political prisoners, allow international organizations to go into East Turkestan, inspect the detention facilities, investigate the crimes on humanity, and determine how many people have been killed. Allow the Uyghurs living abroad to visit their homelands and resume communications between East Turkestan and abroad. And in particular for the US, this slide hasn't been edited by us much. Appeal the US government to grant Uyghurs similar status as Tibetans. That is it from me for going through the slideshow. I hope it hasn't been too long for you.
Thank you for that. Thanks, Sam. If you can move on to the next slide, I'm just going to discuss a little bit more about what you can do. We're so grateful that you've turned up to this presentation today. We've got lots of participants on now, and this is such a live issue. This is such an important issue that we can't sit back and be silent on. As Sam just spoke about, there are people who are being threatened for speaking out. And so for those of us who don't have family members in these concentration camps, it's our duty to do what we can to fight for their rights, just as we would wish that they would do so for us if we were in a similar situation. And so we're encouraging everyone who would like to join our campaign, to join our group if you'd like to. Our email address is uyghursolidaritynz@protonmail.com. I'll be linking it in the chat, and it's also on our Facebook group. So what the campaign we're doing at the moment is in coalition with the people over in England, in Britain, and also teaming up with Australia and the United States of America to pressure the corporations who are using forced Uyghur labour. And that's definitely something that we can all relate to. Like, we all use Microsoft or Apple or clothes from H&M or there's so many corporations that are complicit in this genocide and in this really atrocious human rights situation. So that campaign has just kicked off recently, and it's building pressure. This is something that we can all get behind, and in various different social justice movements and issues, it has been quite successful, the power of pressuring corporations. So I'm reasonably confident that we will have success if we all unite for that. We are happy to do this presentation more times, and we would really welcome if you'd like us to do it for your community. Please just contact us. We've got various social media channels and we encourage you to follow Uyghur rights groups on social media. You can just look them up on Twitter and Facebook, and raise awareness on this issue through sharing information and petitions in your own communities and your own networks. And another step is to arrange to talk with your local MP, because we want the whole of the New Zealand parliamentary system to be aware of how important it is to take a stand on this, and we'll support you to arrange a meeting with your MP and encourage them to take action on human rights. New Zealand, we have this idea of what we are, and I really hope we can live up to it through taking these steps of solidarity.